The ban list channel has returned and rebranded itself as the Tournament Policy channel. Konami has made some updates and some changes to their penalties or tournament guideline thing. Basically, this video is just going to be giving you some updates on what's changed, what you need to know for events, and what you can do to help yourself not get banned. Oh, I thought and from events and years, how it went down. I did nothing wrong and I did nothing wrong whatsoever. I got banned. I didn't even know I got banned. Is it really a Farfa video without a mandatory TRIF reference? So what we have now is a new philosophy section, and in there we have a bit of an update and clarification on the difference between tier 1 and tier 2 events. Tier 1 being casual locals, tier 2 being regional. Some judges, duelists and officials have mistakenly interpreted previous policy to not apply at the tier 1 level, believing that the more casual nature of this tier does not require very much policy or rules enforcement. This has led to one set of rules and policy for tier 1 and a different set of tier 2 or higher, which ultimately does not do anyone any good. Tier 1 tournaments are designed for more casual play and should provide an instructive, enjoyable atmosphere. These tournaments should function as a learning experience, but that does not mean that penalties should not be enforced or that infractions have to be downgraded. Rules and tournament policies are equally important at the tier 1 level and should be enforced. It's strange that in this section they say it's a learning experience, and yet in the introduction in the blog post they say, well, you guys need to enforce this at all levels. And I think that they've pretty much given out a warning to all OTSs and judges and stuff at various locals that you need to enforce these rules whether or not it's a casual locals with children or new players or anything like that, regardless. So nothing's technically changed here, but at the same time, I think it's kind of disappointing because, well, does anyone care if you use double sleeving at a locals? Does anyone care if you use a Dualroid app at locals? I'm not like using pen and paper. I use a dueling app for keeping life points at locals, okay? The food and drink rule that we went over in my previous video, for example, my locals is a cafe, literally. And people eat when they duel. So you tell me can't do that anymore now. Does anyone at the casual local level really care that much about double sleeving or dueling apps on your phone or Googling card text and rulings? No, but I guess we'll deal with it. In regards to this, we now have a new caution section, and this basically goes over what can be considered unintentional minor infractions at the tier 1 level. So it's weird that they say that we have one rule for tier 1 and another rule for tier 2. This isn't the case, and yet here we are with rules for tier 1 and rules for tier 2. So a caution is given to a person at a tier 1 event who commits a minor infraction unintentionally, blah 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 blah. You can kind of just pause the video and have a read through this if you want, but pretty much non-serious issues are just cautioned at locals, which is understandable and it's fair, and that's great. It's locals. In addition to philosophy, we have a clarification on what constitutes rule sharking. It's something I should probably just mention really quickly, because a lot of people are under the impression that if your opponent, for example, just forgets to activate an effect that was optional in the graveyard, and they say, oh, do you mind if I add this Dante back with its effect or whatever, you know, like a chain later, and you say no, that isn't sharking. That's just me saying, no, you suck. Get good and remember your effects. Rule sharking is when you use the rules specifically to get an advantage over your opponent, when you should be trying to get an advantage over your opponent by playing better, not by using rules. To give you an example of that, if my opponent is winning and then out of the blue, I'll just be like, Judge, my opponent's sleeves are a little bit marked. So you didn't have an issue with the sleeves before, but now that you're losing, you want to talk about sleeves, huh? You want to talk about zone placement and how his main deck is tilted 4 degrees to the right now, huh? Suddenly, this is an important thing to discuss and bring up. Oh, and one last thing before we continue. Offensive articles are now having to be removed or whatever from an event. Previously, I don't think they had much of a clarification on it, but I mean, if you showed up with a playmat of just like a swastika, you'd probably get removed for that. But now it's actually clarified in the rules. So if you're one of those, guys, Nothing worse than trying to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And your opponent whips out one of those lewd dark magician mats, and it's just like, dude, like, listen, we all like a bit of the 2D, but can you just keep it to yourself and not flaunt it publicly during a match? Like, we're trying to play here, okay? We're not trying to figure out the intricacies of Space Pirate Sarah episode 3 at the point of where they arrive at the new planet and her... I'll spare you the details, it's not important. Basically, if you just have weird boy stuff on your mat or deck box, just stop. Now it's probably not allowed, okay? Just keep that to your personal stuff at home. We have a clarification on what constitutes a game loss in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now. If a person uses profanity towards another person, so if I tell you as a Draco player to go and heck yourself, yeah, I said the H word. That's probably a game loss. And as well, a duelist throws over a chair in anger after losing a match. Oh, so as long as I win the match, I'm allowed to throw a chair at my opponent. Is that what you're telling me? That's not how this works. You know, a violent outburst is just a game loss. So they can continue with the match. I just feel like this example isn't really going to play out in reality. Let's be real. If you throw a chair at your opponent, you're going to be disqualified and banned from Yu-Gi-Oh! I can promise you and guarantee this, that if you throw a chair at your opponent, you're just going to get disqualified and banned. It's not a very good example. I really can't imagine throwing a chair at your opponent is only going to net you a game loss. Why you have to be mad? It's only a game. Okay, let's get on to the most important section here, the changes to the game state, and what is or isn't considered repairable, irreparable, and accepted. Accepted game state isn't when you cheat on Dueling Book, and then your opponent calls you out on it and you say, no, it's accepted game state. Not that I would have any personal experiences with that or anything. It's just a joke. Why you have to be mad? If a duelist has damaged the game state due to an illegal, missed mandatory effect, etc., gameplay can be wound to the point of the legal action. It should be rewound even if the opponent may gain an advantage from information that was previously private knowledge. Where can you rewind or not rewind game states? We'll go over that in a second, but it's an important section to realize that just because private knowledge has been exchanged, it does not necessitate that you're going to be exempt from this. So yes, if an error has been picked up, maintenance cost wasn't picked up, or something that was important and mandatory that happened in a previous turn, if it's possible to go back, then we will go back, and I'm gonna know that you're gonna summon that Denkos. I'm gonna preemptively flip those trap cards. Okay, that's how it works. Learn how you play your cards, alright? Don't get mad at me, alright? The judge said it. How can you tell the difference between an irreparable game state and a repairable game state? We have an example here, which is a Glad Beast one. A duelist returns a face down to her deck to special summon Heraklinos from the extra without revealing it. There's no way to tell if it was a Glad Beast, so the action is irreparable. It is appropriate to give the duelist a game loss. If I shuffle away a face down monster, and I just say it's a Glad Beast, and I quickly just pick up the face down card, shuffle it into my deck, that would be a game loss because the card is now in the deck. There's no way to verify if that specific card was a Glad Beast. It's to do with being able to 100% verify cards. That's generally the rule of thumb to go to. If you can 100% verify that a card was a Glad Beast, the game should be repairable. If you can't 100% verify whether the card was the card stated in situations like that, it's probably irreparable and will result in a game loss. Now, it should be noted when it comes to irreparable game states that irreparable game states never result in restarting the duel or the match. And on top of that, with irreparable game states, we now have a very big rule and probably the best change in all of these policy documents, and that is an irreparable game state should never result in a double game loss except as an upgrade. Previously, double game losses would be issued if both players fail to maintain mandatory effects or pay maintenance costs to the point that a few turns have gone by and the game state is just kind of busted. Oh, you've been activating effects under Majesty's Fiend this whole time? I forgot. I didn't see. It's on the board. I didn't see, you know? What's going to happen is that the one most at fault shall be the one to be receiving the game loss and the other player receiving a warning. If both duelists share fault in a single game state error that merits a game loss, determine which duelist is most at fault and award that duelist with the game loss. The duelist less at fault should receive a warning. So an actual legitimate cheat previously was that if you win game 1, you could go on to game 2 and then pretend to forget some mandatory effects, some maintenance costs that were being paid by your opponent, let the duel run on for a little bit to the point where multiple cards are drawn and there's no way of repairing the game state, call a judge and say, oh, we forgot that there was a Majesty's Fiend on the field, and we've been activating monster effects, or my opponent has been searching with mistake, or something like that. That previously would probably result in something like a double game loss. And if you get a double game loss after winning game 1, well, you won the match, 2-1. You'd get a fraction and a warning against your name for the rest of the tournament, but I guess for some people that's a soul for a soul, a small sacrifice in the greater scheme. So to summarize, again, irreparable game state. Generally, when cards cannot be 100% verified, will be considered irreparable. What is considered a repairable game state? Well, we have an example here. A duelist shuffles his hand with his deck. Wait a second, how do you just shuffle your hand into your deck? My hand, it fell in the deck and I shuffle. Sorry, it's mistake. It's okay. These examples are not very good, Konami. A duelist shuffles his hand with his deck. However, he had revealed his hand to the opponent earlier in the turn due to a card effect and has not drawn or played any additional cards. Both duelist and the opponent can clearly remember the context. If it is appropriate for the duelist to restore his hand, reshuffle, and continue to play with a warning. The key thing to remember generally between the difference between repairable and irreparable game states is the exchange of knowledge that cannot be 100% verified. If the card effect was like Mind Crush and we could... Never mind, that's not how that works anymore. Respect play was on the field or something, so you could see both hands, and he accidentally shuffles his hand away. As long as you could 100% verify what every single card was before he accidentally shuffled his entire hand away for no reason into the deck, at that point it would be repairable because you would know every single card that he had in his hand at that point, and the game state would be repairable. Repairable game states are when you can 100% verify the cards drawn or whatever during that period in time. And then for accepted game states, they are basically irreparable game states that have been deemed to be unintentional, I think is probably the best way to describe this and the best rule of thumb that I can offer. The example given here is that both duelists misread a card effect and resolve the effect incorrectly. The error is caught later when one duelist plays another copy. The judge investigates and determines that both players genuinely misunderstood the effect. Both duelists should receive a warning, and it is both the responsibility to maintain the correct game state, and game should continue from that point. So there's kind of like a bit of a fine line and blur between a accepted game state and an irreparable game state, and I feel like the example seems to indicate that it's somewhere to do with the intention. Not only the intention, but how major or minor of an impact it might have had on the game. Again, this is very all contextual and kind of just down to the judge's discretion at this point. A duelist forgets to resolve a mandatory effect, and neither duelist notices until a few turns later. After investigation, the judges determined that the infraction was unintentional, but neither duelist is clearly able to recall what happened in the game after the error. Both duelists should receive a warning, as both duelists' responsibility to maintain the correct game state, and game should continue from that point. So as I mentioned, it seems like the difference between an accepted and a irreparable game state lies probably somewhere within the realm of intention and how much of an impact it has made on the greater game of that specific match. You could argue that regardless of what happens, an impact has been made, but I think it's more to do with the severity and both players' kind of involvement in that. I hope I've clarified that as best as I can, and that's the best example that I could think to give after asking around about this specifically. But yeah, we're looking at something like intention and severity, basically. And the final part of game state is misrepresenting the game state. So in this section, we'll be talking about some of the things that constitute deceiving your opponent in a malicious way that affects the game state and how it's run. So for the first example I've got here is a duelist intentionally places a stack of tokens face down in the extra deck zone. Do you guys remember when Monarchs were a deck that didn't run an extra deck, and you would probably make your play differently against them depending on whether or not they had an extra deck? Well, in order to combat this, some people would play a stack of tokens in their extra deck. 15 tokens, actually. Just to, yeah, tokens. I need my tokens, man. I gotta resolve my lasses or vassals? Is that the word? I think it was the vassals. One of them had a token. I need 15 of them, okay? Like, it might happen. So people would do this as a way to prevent their opponent from realizing they were playing Monarchs or True Draco when Erupt was a popular thing, and I guess it kind of still is, but you know. That's now illegal because you're deceiving your opponent by presenting a 15 card extra deck. Even if you don't say it's an extra deck, just the fact that you have it in that zone, you're heavily implying that you have extra deck cards, and therefore you are misrepresenting the game state and are an awful, horrible, terrible person for playing Draco in the first place, to be honest. Regardless of these changes, you're just a bad person for playing Draco. Wow, I made it through like 10 minutes of a video without slating Draco players until now. That's a record for... I'm sorry, that was toxic. A duelist suggests to his opponent that they should not side Fairy Wind as they go into game 2 of their match, then proceeds to side in Fairy Wind anyway. I think that this is a very weird example because suggesting to your opponent to side or not side cards sounds like a very gray area, and I believe that could be considered some form of collusion under tournament policy, so I'm not 100% certain about that. That just doesn't seem like a good example to use, but regardless, this is the infamous Jin example, if you remember from Patrick Hoban's days, where he would ask his opponent, let's both side out Jin, and they would both side out the Jin, but Hoban would be siding a second copy, 400 IQ. Side that one, and now my opponent sided out all of their Jin outs, and I have a Colossalus on the field that prevents special summoning. Well, this has now been formally made illegal. Thank you everyone for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I've done my best to clarify and fact check a lot of this stuff, so hopefully everything in this video should be pretty easy to understand, and yeah, leave a comment down below with any questions that you might have. I have a Discord server, discord.gg/Farfa, and in there you can find a bunch of judges. There's a ruling section for anything that you might want to figure out, and yeah, it's a good way to connect with me as well and my community, so feel free to join the Discord server. Follow me on twitch.tv/FarfaYGO, and all the other social media links in the description, like Twitter, etc. Leave a comment and a like and subscribe if you're new and you want to see more of my content and videos. Until next time, adios.
Oh, I thought and promise and years how it went down. I did nothing wrong and I did nothing wrong whatsoever. I got and I didn't even know I got that.